hearty welcome to this book launch, celebrating Dr. Sindiwe Magona's latest book. Here you see the cover, I Write the Yawning Void, published by Wits University Press. In fact, this month we celebrate Dr. Sindiwe Magona, not only for this publication of her latest book, but we toast her many accomplishments as a writer. But before I begin, for those of you who don't know the CMDR, the work we do in the center is to rethink multilingualism and the development of new discourses with which to approach interdisciplinary work in the humanities and the education sciences. So our work involves interrogating contemporary and historical African intellectual heritage through a critical review of the role of language, multilingualism, multilingual education, literature, and citizenship in the colonial archive. But at the same time, we use this work to critically reframe multilingualism and diversity. So this is our intellectual space. This is where Dr. Sindiwe Magona and others work. And we meet each other to raise questions that further the debate about language, multilingual literatures, linguistic citizenship, multilingual education, and what it means to participate in a post-apartheid humanities. In the CMDR, Dr. Sindiwe Magona's work and research has found a home, and her work fits very well. When you look at the table there to my right, it's just a drop in the ocean of what she has accomplished. We all know she's an award-winning author, and recently she received the NIHSS Emeritus Writing Fellowship, and since the publication of this book, she has received numerous awards. My emails keep on, it's like a revolving door, just coming in, For example, when you look at the book, there's a sticker on it. It's a blue and red sticker, and it says the book has been selected by News 24 as the book of the month. But she's also been selected by the exclusive book homebrew campaign for 2023. There's something I've learned over the last few weeks, so there's a bit of feedback. This is a bit loud, I think. Just from attending other book launches about this book. You learn that when Dr. Magona, and she will probably tell you about this a bit more, her writing comes from a place of struggle. I heard her say recently that her writing comes initially from a place of defiance too, that she wrote against and in defiance of the apartheid government and the classification of her as black. And that she decided to write, and I quote because I memorized this, in spite of the government, despite the government, to spite the government. Isn't that great? I think we can all agree that that principle has endured throughout her writing. So Dr. Magona, congratulations again from myself and colleagues in the CMDR. We wish you, well, and that you sell a lot of copies of the book. We hope. And we also hope, colleagues, friends, you have taken time out of your schedule, that you will find tonight, the discussion tonight, as intellectually stimulating as well. So thank you very much. The program tonight is as follows. Our colleague, Professor Duncan Brown, will present some thoughts entitled Sindiwe Magona, Writing and Reading Across Genre. Then Dr. Magona will sit down with Professor Meg van der Merwe, who's in the English department, and this sort of spearheads UWC Creates. They will sit down to talk about the book and that we are celebrating, and Professor Meg van der Merwe will also read some extracts from the book. Then we'll move into a Q&A phase, after which we hope that you enjoy some of the lunch. Not the lunch, I'm thinking of lunch. Something to eat and drink to celebrate further and to speak to our celebrity. The book is on sale at the very cheap price of 350 Rand, and if you didn't bring any cash, you can tap or swipe. Please buy it. So next, I want you to please give a hand of applause to our colleague, Professor Duncan Brown. Duncan?
Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see you here. It's really a great honor for me to speak at the launch of Sindiwe Magona's I Write the Yawning Void. I first encountered Sindiwe's work in the early 1990s, when To My Children's Children was the third year English set work that I taught at the University of Natal in Durban. It was an extraordinary text in many ways, and I wondered at this remarkable writer who had the vision to set down her story and the stories of those who came before her in the form of a letter, so that her children's children, and by implication all of us, should know the history that they came from. And an author who could do it in writing that was marked by honesty, pathos, humour, pain, and hope. Never in my wildest dreams could I have imagined that we would end up being colleagues. I still get something of a start when I walk down the passage and see Dr. Magona on one of his doors. Dr. Magona, Professor Croft, just flying high. In thinking about what to say at this launch, I went back to My Children's Children to see what I made of it now that I'd read so much of Sindiwe's other work. It has the most prophetic cover blurb, because it says, "This articulate, spirited and poignant letter is her first book." Then wait for it. There will certainly be more. 180 somewhat children's books later, all the novels, the short story. The text, I found again in the text a verve, poignancy, directness and commitment to hope in the face of all odds that have become the hallmarks of Sindiwe's fiction. The text is offered with humility. The dedication reads, "For Sindiwe, Thokozile and Sandile, my children who brought me up." It's offered with humility but never deference, and a wry humour punctuates even the most difficult of circumstances. There's a passage near the end that I find immensely moving, in which Sindiwe, with a very young baby, has to act as parent to her own children and her young siblings. I'd like to read it for you. Sindiwe, I prefer it if you'd read it, but...
I want you to read.
If you want to.
I can't read.
Oh yes, you can. It seems to me to speak volumes of Sindiwe, her life and her work. The picture is clear today, for it has not for one day left me. I had a pot boiling away on the primus stove. The children waited and waited. The pot boiled away on the stove. The children waited for the food to cook. First, Sindiwe, the eldest, always a sleepy child, dropped off. I scooped her up from the floor and put her to bed. Sandile, the baby, was no problem. Mother's milk was always there. One by one, the other children, brackets my siblings, fell asleep. As I took occasional promising peeps at the pot, one by one, the children fell asleep. Thokozile was the last to do so. I put her next to the others on the bed. I switched off the stove and gratefully crept into bed myself, silently sending a prayer of thanks to God for the gift of hope. Without the hope that they would be getting something to eat, the children would have been restless, crying for food. They'd fallen asleep unaware that nothing more than God's clean water was in the pot, busy boiling away on the primus stove. I think it's fair to say that it's a remarkable passage. I think it's fair to say that Sindiwe's work is issue-driven. And what I mean by that, I don't mean that it's didactic or programmatic. Her stories and characters do not fail to engage the reader's interest, even as they deal with pressing social concerns, In her novel, she addresses issues such as HIV/AIDS, gender-based violence, patriarchy, the importance of self-sufficiency, and so on, in ways that really humanize these issues and their implications. There is a marked courage in doing so, as the positions she takes are often in direct opposition to those in power. Beauty's Gift, for example, states directly that knowingly infecting someone with HIV/AIDS is murder. This was at the time that Thabo Mbeki was refusing to dispense antiretrovirals, and he is directly criticized in the novel for his claim. She deals with the issues that women need to stand up to men in the HIV/AIDS pandemic, in protecting their own health. And she notes that the pandemic is both a personal and a national tragedy. Sindiwe has a deep commitment to the language isiXhosa and the history and the cultural values that attend it, a commitment that reaches far beyond her fiction. It involves a deep value attached to local knowledge and expression, but also a critical eye, for example, in identifying how patriarchy and sexism are so often defended as traditional cultural values. A colleague observed to me about Chasing the Tails of My Father's Cattle that it was one of the very few texts she had read from South Africa in which the white gaze was absent. Not in an aggressive gesture of separatism, but simply because the world which it explored had its own internal coherence and did not need external validation. I found the observation very perceptive. Sindiwe's herb is very wide, as my title suggests. It seems she takes on different genres as she needs them, understanding the different reading publics they address. She's written 2 volumes of autobiography, some of which many of the books are here, produced 2 volumes of short stories and several novels. She co-wrote Charlie Jones's biography, Theatre Ode. Most notably, she must be one of the most prolific children's writers in South Africa. The author's bio in the republication of Beauty's Gift in 2018 indicates that she has written over 130 children's books. She says that it's now closer to over 180. Just take the time to ponder that. One of her books in this genre, co-authored with the American sociologist Nina Jablonski, seeks in a very accessible format to get children thinking about the arbitrariness of linking value to skin color. On top of all of this, which includes honorary doctorates and multiple awards for her work, she recently went back to being a student and received a PhD. Now, with I Write the Yawning Void, she's ventured into yet another genre, the critical or self-reflective essay, a genre of which Sindiwe says it is the most honest way of expressing yourself. The editor of the book, Nash Shatterman and Wits University Press, are to be congratulated for publishing these issues in which we see Sindiwe as public intellectual. Shatterman's foreword provides a perceptive assessment of Sindiwe's work, and the essays are fresh and direct, as well as providing Sindiwe's thoughts on broader social issues such as race, language, poverty, and so on. The series of Why I Wrote, Beauty's Gift, Why I Wrote, Chasing the Tails of My Father's Cattle, those pieces are extremely enabling and engaging for readers and critics of her work. I can't imagine too many other writers having the courage to attempt something like that. Sorry, the pages are sticking together. Here we go. In the field of South African literature, Sindiwe Magona is a strong original voice, whose latest work we celebrate tonight. I think the opening lines of To My Children's Children, which seem to me something of a credo, are a good way to end. Child of the child of my child, as ours is an oral tradition, I would like you to hear from my own lips what it was like living in the 1940s onwards. what it was like in the times of your great-grandmother, me. However, my people no longer live long lives. Generations no longer set eyes on one another. Therefore, I fear that I'm not live long enough to do my duty to you, to let you know who you are and whence you are. So I will for you, so I will for you my words in this manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. That was beautiful. Well, the next thing to do is just to invite Dr. Magona up to the stage and Professor Mick Peneleva to please have a seat and talk to us.
Better? Yeah. Okay. I was in the library at EWC this afternoon, and I sourced one of the books on the shelves. I like to have a little sniff around the English department resources. There's a lot of Renaissance in there and a lot of dead white men. What I did find is a lot. They did smell like bookworm. But amongst these tomes was a very used, worn, so red, Sindiwe, so red, that the cover had been worn off. You know, it was just the cardboard that was left, which to my children's children. And it was the first edition from 1990. And I thought, this is a book that's actually been taken out. And this is a book that's been read and touched, and there were pencil lines throughout it. And the cover has been worn off, and I thought, this is a book that's been read, that's been devoured by countless UWC students. And I opened it up, and I came to the same opening, which was that quote about you addressing your future children's children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, that you thought you'd never have a chance to speak directly to, that you'd never be given the space to speak to. And who could have foreseen that we'd be sitting here today, Sindiwe, on the eve of your 80th birthday? Not only with you having been invited and celebrated, right? But honoured in this way. And it feels like a great privilege to me. And it feels like a great privilege to all the students at UWC who since 1990 have read that book and literally worn the cover off with their hands. So just thank you. Thank you for that. So I'm not going to now read that quote because Duncan did. I should have actually brought it to show you. Okay, but we are going to talk about another book which I feel confident one day in 30, 40 years' time, some academic will be sniffing around the book stacks in there and will also find that this book has been worn and touched and read and underlined, which is I Write the Yawning Void. Okay. So already Quentin stole my Stevens Book of the Month from News 24. These are not small achievements. In South Africa, where there's relatively few celebrations of the printed book left, okay? Most of the book review pages have gone. Most of the book programs have gone. So it's a major achievement. Let's talk about it. I know Renee, I remember when Renee came there on her fellowship, and you guys began working on this together. And I've struck here, Renee says, okay, first of all, it comprises 16 pieces, 6 of which were previously published, but 10 of which have never been read before. So it really does make a very important contribution to your voice, I feel, and legacy as an author. I love the fact that the topics range from politics to literature, to your own inspirations in literature, and so much in between. Humanity, there's a wonderful speech where you celebrate Andre Brinkin here. But it says here, Magona considers it to be, quote, the most honest way of presenting herself. The most honest way. Now, I know you're not a lady who uses words lightly. So I'm interested to know why all the genres, and you've really touched, you've done poetry. Is there a genre you haven't done? No, I'm actually not being facetious, I'm being serious. No, but seriously, you've done fiction, you've done poetry, you've done plays, you've done autobiography, you've done biographies for other people. Why do you feel this is the genre which you've come to last, so to speak, on that list, but certainly not least, the most honest way of presenting yourself? Can you tell me about that?
No, it didn't come to, thanks, Meg, it didn't come to me last.
But I mean, oh, you're right, you're right.
Last as published.
Published, yeah.
But I wrote, we grew up writing essays in school.
I was thinking that. As I was looking at that. The shelves were full of those books in the library. How to write a good essay.
But published is the last one. I've always loved essays. But publishers don't want essays. They say they don't sell. So that's why I haven't written or published essays before.
It's very practical of you.
No, because, I mean, one writes to be published. If nobody's going to publish them, then you don't write them.
I know, I understand. It's a terrible bind we're in. But hopefully this News 24 and all the other things will change publishers' minds.
And I hope, to go back to your question, that for me, an essay feels more really honest. It's like a conversation. I don't have to be thinking about style and who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist and what is the issue and where's the high point of the conflict. You just talk. It's the easiest for me to just talk. I like talking. Not talking in front of people like now. This is better? Is this better?
Yeah.
Why don't you have
Then
a
something
mic?
is wrong with me.
You're the most important. I can project mine.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay.
It's even easier.
It wasn't me, it was the instrument. No, with an essay, really, you have something to say, you say it. With a story, you have to plot, you have to find characters, you have to find incidents, and you don't have to. You just tell your story with an essay. Yes, you have to put some thoughts. It's not you have to make sure it makes sense to you and to respect the reader. You have to go back and read again. Did I really say the way I feel about it? So it's not as if it's easy because you don't care or you don't nurture it the way you. But it's easier because it's more relaxed. You are more yourself. You are more person to person. I really feel as though when I write an essay, I am in conversation with the listener. For me, then it's more honest, it's more open.
One of the things I admire about your work is you have a very distinct voice. Your voice can be heard throughout your work. And I think that if you pick up a novel or an essay, I can hear it's you, even if I don't know it's you. Does that make sense? And I'm wondering if that is part of the oral tradition that you come from. That I feel if I'm reading a novel that you've written, as you said, not all works feel like someone's speaking to you. In the tradition of the oral tradition. But with Sindiwe's works, I find that is the case. There is a sense that I can hear you talking directly to me.
Okay, thanks. Better? So I want to know, I'm wondering, because you said that about you don't have to think about character or, but I'm looking at this first essay, The Scars of Umlungu, and it's very clever. What I love about this anthology is that it works kind of chronologically. I love those. I love when you can see how someone's ideas have evolved. So you can look at the earliest essay and you look at the end, you see how people have been carried and how their voice has been carried. And, you do something very clever. This was published in 1992, in April 1992. And you use the language of symbolism, you use the language of the figurative, and you say here, so the scars of Umlungu. My people have their own way of doing things. We've always had our way of doing things. quote, the ones scrubbed in hot water, end quote, could not see this when they came. They came, quote, the ones with coloured eyes, end quote, and found my people living worthwhile lives that were satisfying to them. But the newcomers saw only indolence, ignorance, and superstition. They saw nothing commendable, nothing worth preserving, least of all emulating. I'm going to jump now, but so began the destruction of my culture, so began our dying. And then later on, the next page, they had not learnt the greed that brings fences with it. Later, when the newcomers cut up the land, cut it up until it bled, the stakes driven hard into its very heart, barbed wire strangling its breath, my people found themselves lessened, reduced. They were fenced in. They could no longer heal the land. So, you know, you're using a very particular register there. There's the collective, the allegorical, but also it reminds me of Mackay. When he talks about the warns about the Umlungu coming and the different kind of warning symbols. Does that make sense? So for me, I can see that literary tradition, that oral tradition. Am I right, Sindiwe? For example, in that essay, quite palpably to me, or am I wrong? Were you thinking of that tradition when you wrote that essay, your first essay in the collection?
Which tradition?
The tradition of like Mackay's use of in isiXhosa and...
No, I can't say yes and I can't say no. And I'm being honest. I am not...
essay in here about
I'm not very well educated in the sense of I didn't study Mackay. You know, when we were in school way back then, really the study of literature was appallingly poor. So I can't say I had an in-depth understanding of Mackay, in fact, really no. However, I also acknowledge the fact that I do belong to Mackay in the sense that I read his work a little bit, I read Jolobe, but I am Xhosa, Xhosa. And that means I have imbibed the same kind of, stories and beliefs and that he did. When he died, I was, 3? But we come from the same culture, the same tradition. So I have some of, not to the same extent, but tradition lives in us. And there's no escaping that. Attitudes live in us. And you cannot escape them. All of us here have in us things we shouldn't have got into us. Some of those we chose to bring in, but a lot of what you have inside you, you had no choice, but you also could not escape. COVID taught us a little bit of that. When, I talk about bad, the kind of hate attitudes we shouldn't have, nobody can escape that. Nobody alive, not only in this country, worldwide. Your parents don't sit you down and say, hey, this one, and no. But how do you escape it? It's in the air. There's no escape. So the tradition is in me.
And yet you did escape the hate. I'm going to come to that now, if I may. It leads nicely. I want to add that, in the later essays, why I wrote When the Village Sleeps, and also in the essay that's from a speech about Andre Brink. It's very difficult to do all these things. A tribute to those who came before me. Those are the last essays in the collection. You do talk about Mackay and other writers who influenced you. And I was a PhD supervisor, so I know Mackay.
I'm so happy I'm done. Thank you, Meg, but bye.
No, I'm just saying that I know that she drew on his work. So for me, it's interesting that that what was maybe going on in the background for you comes to the fore in later work. But let's talk about that, because the first essay, I'm very interested. There's two things I noticed in these essays, which all essays carry. One are trends, you know, that, for example, this reoccurring concepts, flavors, voice, a kind of courage and directness in your writing, a great humanity. There's a lot of hope as well. So, I mean, I would say that hope is a reoccurring consistency throughout the essays, and it's there in that first essay. And what's in I went to the launch of this book at the Book Lounge, and what you said that really struck me, if I may share it, was that when you wrote To My Children's Children, the reason you wrote that intro, was because no one thought apartheid would end. You didn't think apartheid would end in your lifetime at the time, in 1990.
Nobody alive. The
Right.
politician, nobody in South Africa, black, white, anything. The ones who were politically engaged and were killing people and killing one, it doesn't matter who. I've talked to them. I worked at the UN in the anti-apartheid radio section. I know what I'm talking about. Mandela didn't do. Nobody thought apartheid would die during our lifetime. Yes, there was the anti-apartheid, but that was for the future. Nobody alive who thought it would die. But we thought maybe maybe in 20, in 100, all the systems, will die eventually, but not in our lifetime. So I was writing for posterity.
But that's what makes the hope in these essays, okay, these early essays, even more extraordinary. And I think that what I find extraordinary about these essays is they're often tackling what's dark at the moment, what is on your chest, what is you're finding is making you uncomfortable, profoundly uncomfortable. So they're not celebratory, joyful essays on the surface, most of them. I write the yawning void. I think that says it all, really. And yet, there's this consistent note of hope. Can you tell me more about that, please? Or us more about that?
To me, of all the sentiments we have, hope is the most important. It's crucial that we have hope, because without it, we are lost. If one doesn't have hope, what are you living for? You might as well curl up and die right now. It doesn't, especially when you are not in a happy place, when your life is not where you think or believe it should be. The one thing that will sustain you is hope. It's that hope that you can change, you can get up, you can rise from this dark place and be in it. That's what will keep you going. That's what will give you courage. That's what should spur you to look around you and find ways of getting out of that situation. Because if you don't have hope, what will make you find a way out? Life is never really a bed of roses for anybody. When one is poor, as I was, you think if I had money. When one sees or reads now about wealthy, and I mean filthy rich people who commit suicide because they are unhappy. It's not money only that gives you happiness. Hope. Hope is better than money. Hope is wealth because it gives you a better understanding of the fact that life is made. Your life, you are giving your life to struggle through the ups and downs. No life is plain like that. Every life has peaks and valleys, and yours is to find a way of walking through those, climbing when it's going right, and when you fall, make sure you don't get to rock bottom. Have the hope you can climb up. There will be a better tomorrow. Find ways to find your way out of the, you've fallen into. Have the hope. And when you have that hope, it opens your eyes. So you look around. Once you start working to change your life. Nobody's going to give you change. You are the agent of change in your life. Others can help, but they won't start working on you if you are sitting there doing nothing. Your life is a free gift. Yours is to mind it. That's all. You don't buy life. You can be poor, rich, but you didn't pay for your life. It comes to you free. But once you're given it, once you reach a certain, you can't say that to a 2-year-old and the parents should be, But once you reach 12 and 14, you should know by then what's right and wrong, what will help you become better, and what drug. If you're 12 and you decide to drink or to do drugs, your common sense should tell you you're going down. You have seen people around you. We have role models of people going up or people going down. Why would you choose to follow the role modeling of someone going down when you have a brain here? Your good sense, your common sense which you were born with, and the little bit of, nurturing you got from your parents, from relatives, from all around you, from the good books you read. Read. It will complement any deficiency in your life. Good reading is there to help you grow. And so hope for me is really the key ingredient of keeping a human being, struggling for better, for more. Not only for self, because if you do right by you, you will have the capacity to do right by others. Whereas if you damage yourself, you have nothing to offer the world.
Thank you. So, whilst hope absolutely is there, there's also a shift in the emotions behind these essays. So the earlier essays, there's a sense of outrage, okay, that runs throughout your work, and I understand that. Speaking truth to power. But what I did find interesting was how your relationship shifts towards Umlungu, if I may say that. So the first essay, The Scars of Umlungu, the Umlungu is described in a collective, the Umlungu, okay, one collective entity. And then Clawing at Stones, this is how it starts, fear of change. I have seen the thick welted scars, and just what struck me, is that the first essay is called The Scars of Umlungu, and then the next essay is called Clawing at Stones, but it carries this motif of scars again in it, a few years later. Fear of change. I've seen the thick welted scars on people rudely plucked from hearth and home, bound, hand and bleeding foot, kicked, punched, raped and ravaged, every which way you dare to think, killed in their millions and dumped on icy wave. And today, those unlucky enough to survive the gruesome plunder annoy the world by failing to be quiet. Quite human, by falling short of accepted standards of civilization. Never mind that on these people was performed a national lobotomy that has left them with no tongue of their own. So, reading this as a literary scholar, I can hear your rage at the system, but also your rage at those individuals who you feel maybe have had that national lobotomy. There's also a crying out for action. But what I found interesting was, as I traced your essays, who would have thought that then, at the very end, you've got this tribute to Andre Brink, right? And, if ever there was a white Afrikaans writer, and you say here, which I loved, Sindiwe, let me find it. Sorry, it's very hard to hold a mic, hold a pen, hold my brain, and find my marks. Yeah, here we go. So you've been asked, obviously, it's taken from the Franschhoek Literary Festival, and Corina, Andre's fifth wife, as she likes to call herself sometimes, had asked you to speak. He'd passed away. And you say, he is someone I could and did call a friend, and from whom I drew tremendous courage to go on, going on, living my life mindfully of what it was I was doing with my pen. And then you also say, there are not many white male South Africans whose passing I have mourned. But with Andre Brink, I was not really saddened when he left us. I mourned his passing. So there is a shift in your perspective as well. Can you talk a bit about that?
I grew as a human being. I no longer, and I have it for some time, I no longer look at people and think I know who they are because of the color of their skin. I no longer judge anyone. I'm not saying the attitudes are not there. I know I have those attitudes. But I, like everybody else, must know it's my business. It is my business to live in awareness of the baggage I carry. What I do not want done to me, I hated being classified Bantu and being treated as Bantu. I'm not Bantu, I'm a human being, unique. So are you, so are you, so are you. The color of your skin means bokoro to me. It's what you do, what you say, how you act, who you really, really are. No one is skin color. Don't look at anybody and think you know them because of what they look like outside. I grew up, nobody ever told me these are better, these are not, but the attitudes come into you. By the time you're 10, you know, it's in my essays. You know who you'd like to be if you had a choice in your being born. Okay? But as I grew older and read more and studied a little, I came to understand. By the time I was writing Skin We Are In, I was fully convinced, because the thing I hated about apartheid was that I was lumped together with people I didn't know, people I didn't care, some of whom I really hated. Not because of color skin, because of their characters, because of the things they did or did not do. If you know of a father, like somebody I went to their book launch recently, how would you like a man? He would have been classified Bantu like me. How would you get to identify with a man who is in his 50s, who has two, I'm going to talk about the two sons, whose one son was born prematurely and the mother died as she was giving birth to this child, and the mother died because she had AIDS, and this child, who is now 23 or 24, was infected. So this poor young man grew up, will always, okay? Then this man marries, he has another son. Didn't tell the second wife he was infected. So of course she's living with AIDS, she told me. But because she found out, she protected her unborn. Her 18-year-old is not infected. This SWINE, he doesn't care for this child. This man, boy, who is 23, hasn't been to the bush. His grandmother raised him. He's raised by, because the mother died, remember? And this new mother, his stepmother, raised him. When he didn't want to be there, he came to, children are like that, came to grandma. When he was 16, grandma want to go to dad. Grandmother says, here's money, take the bus, he's over there in that other city. He gets there, father gives, here's 500, go back, I don't want you here. At the door, didn't say come in, take the bus back. It is this stepmother, who has just enabled this young man who dropped out of school at grade 11 to get a learner's license. She's going to enable him to get a license so that at least he might get a job as a driver. Father, nothing to do. How do I identify with that person because we have the same skin color? I don't. When I say I don't want to be lumped together with other Bantu, I don't say I'm not Bantu. But just because I'm Bantu doesn't mean my characters are the same as all other. Bantus, no Bantus are the same. No one is the same as anyone. Every human being is unique. And that's what I say we must respect. If I want that for myself, I can't then turn around and lump other people in one basket because of color scheme. That would really be dumb, wouldn't it? If it's wrong when it's done to me, how can I turn around and do it to other people? I don't. So by the time I started writing, and I got embraced by people like Andre Prim, who said he admired my writing, that was like Professor Duncan just said when he sees me, he wants to say, oh my, I feel like that when I say, oh my God, there's Duncan Brown. So the thing is, respect for one another should be really how we live. Ubuntu demands it of us. If you have no respect for other human beings, you are not a human being because you don't recognize kind. Kind recognizes kind. And who is my kind? Hopefully similarly minded people, people who think like me, progressive thinking people. I will not hate anybody because of skin color. And I have then been accused of being a sellout. That's fine. That's my burden. That's the burden I carry for my convictions. But no one is going to convert me to being a white hater or anybody hate. I will not hate people for skin color. Never. Not while I have this brain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sindiwe. The last questions, we've only got 5 minutes left.
We do?
Yeah.
Then we will eat.
Then there's questions. So the other thing that, okay, so we've talked about shifts and we've talked about consistencies. There's something that's also been a shift and a consistency together, and that's children. So from the very first book, the very first essays, you have been a champion for children. And your last essays also talk about children. And what I found interesting, and it's profound and makes me very sad, is that you were championing for children in 1990, where you felt that your children would not be able to hear and be carried by your wisdom and because of the situation of apartheid. And your latest essays are also about championing children and feeling that they're being let down by the current system. One thing that hasn't changed is that. Can you talk about it?
My appetite. I don't even want the food anymore. Children are the future of a nation. Our future is bleak.
She doesn't look very happy.
No, she's wondering when she's going to eat. Our future is bleak. I may get the stat a little bit wrong, but don't worry about it. The fact is bad enough. 80%, if not more, of the children in this country are not thriving. That means they are not, their potential is wasted. They are not growing as they ought to. What does that mean? 80% of the future of this country is dead. 80% of the future of the country is going to be people who kill each other to eat. How are they going to make a living if they're not thriving? 80% of our young people, the children of this, are not thriving. When you see the matric results, which by themselves are not that much, we are the only country, I know there may be others, go and do your research, but in my reading, I haven't seen a country that reduces the standard of qualification. When I was in school, you needed 40% for a pass, 50 for a B or what, I may be wrong, 60 for a C, for a first class more. Now we pass people on 30, what, 25% does it reach that? But we have lowered the grade level, the percentage, the percentage point of passing. That should tell you something. We should have been working harder to uplift the learners No, we say stay dumb and we'll accommodate your dumbness. Ask yourself why. For me, it's clear. You dumb people to control them. You don't want critical thinking. You don't want people who might challenge you. Let them stay dumb and they will vote for you. You are buying votes. Whoever you are, you want a mess of people because these are the voters. But you want voters that are not really voters. Because if you go there and I'm thinking you put crosses here and there, you're not really voting, are you? Voting means you are aware of what you want the people you send to Parliament to do for you. What is more, after you've chosen whoever, doesn't matter who they are, to go there, you remain aware that they represent your wishes. They are there to do your wishes, not theirs. And then you watch that they do, so that if they do, you reward them by sending them back. If they don't, you punish them by taking them off. We won't. We won't take anybody off because we are voting according to skin, color, hair, etc. That is not voting. I'm not saying vote for white people. I'm not saying vote for black people. I say vote for people who do right by you as a voter. Who do right by you as a voter. That's why you have a brain. Challenge authorities. That's not an insult. When authority goes around just before you vote, here's a basket of food, vote for me. You are botched. You are not a voter. You are a hungry stomach. So if you're going to rule the country through hungry tummy, that's the country you will get. Your children are being dumped, they don't go to school. Taxi violence. Why do we depend on taxis to go to work? What happened to what is called in all countries in the world a public transportation system? Where is ours? Where are the trains and the buses? Why do we depend on taxis? That taxi owners can say, we can stop this city from functioning and do. See now, if we had voters who had power, the day the taxi driver said we're going back to work, they would have sat down and said, you go to work, we're going to boycott you for a day. Give them a taste of their medicine. But we don't have that power because we are poor. Why are we poor? We don't have the skills. Why don't we have the skills? We didn't get a good education. Are our children, the children of the poor, getting a better deal? Guess what? What they are getting is worse than what their parents got under apartheid. Go and put that in your pipe and smoke it. I mean, who would have thought there could be something worse than Bantu education? We are not moving up. We are not even stagnating. We are, what is the opposite of progress? We are doing the opposite of progress. We really are.
We're dying.
And you are, yeah, we're dying. You know, I really we had a workshop this morning and met an excellent session. She finished by saying to these young people, you give me hope. My tears started coming. I agree with Meg. I look at you and I'm also hopeful, but I'm also so sad because we have left you in this shitty situation here. Excuse my French. We have left you all this, we have left so much mud on the ground. How are you all going to live and have a real future, a better life in the stupid country we have left for you? But there is hope. If we, even now, not all is lost. If we can really sit down and be honest and deal with these things we have not dealt with openly, honestly, towards the purpose of killing poverty. There will be no reconciliation until we kill poverty. We must be determined to kill poverty. And I don't mean start that slowly, step by step. Like say next year, next 5 years, no more poor. We can do it if we want to. There will be a way where there's a will.